invited to, among my many colleagues in the department, to talk a little bit about, give their thoughts about the new strategic environment. And you know, it's also interesting, we are towards the end of the year. I'm actually writing my monthly column for a journal, and what is it about? Well, it's about the end, what's happened in 2016 and where we are going to 2017. So in that sense, it's also interesting to hear your approach, your comments. So Professor Aydin.
I'm not going to give you ideas for your column.
No,
I'll keep them to myself.
I already wrote it.
Okay, good. I put down some, well, let me see, 7 challenges. I didn't look at the strategic environment. I look at what new security challenges or the current security challenges that we are facing today, as far as I can see them. Let me start something that doesn't look like it related to security, but I think in a wider picture, in the strategic picture, it is. I don't know how to name it, but I've been talking about this. There is this a problem of leadership around the world, a global leadership gap, if you like. This is something that I started to realize a couple of years ago when I wanted to invite an important person to Kadir Has University to speak about the future of globe, the world. And you know, we went through a number of names, and this could be, he could be good, she could be bad, and you know, all this kind of. And at the end we said, you know, there is nobody globally today in politics, I mean, not academics, not journalists or anything, in politics, that has a kind of a standing that, for example, Winston Churchill had. Or not that long ago, but let's go 1970s, you know, towards the end of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, and Gorbachev in other side. These were leaders people listened to, and they had ideas, whether you like them or not, whether you agree with their ideas or not. They had a vision about the future of how their countries should be, how the world should govern. That, from a maybe neo-realist perspective, is a good thing, because they help to create a system in international relations and for international security. It helps to pacify the relationship globally. But today, when you look around, I would ask you also, which leader would you like to listen about the future of the world? I mean, there is none. Not in our countries, for sure, but the United States, Europe, Merkel, maybe, but you know, I'm pretty sure she's not a fascinating speaker either, or thinker as well. She's very good doer, you know, she's very good doing things, but not. So I think this is a problem, because today when we are talking about the future of the world and the security problems, we don't have a leader who can take force, induce other leaders, let's do this, this is good. And we are seeing the result of this globally in different conflict, in different regions in various conflicts. Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, these are all unsolved problems. Refugee crisis, it's still unsolved. You know, I mean, everything that I'm going to talk, and maybe we will all talk, remains unsolved because there is no leadership globally. I think this is an important problem. A related issue, my second point, is not only there is no leadership as I like to understand in the world, but a different type of leadership is actually emerging. A leadership globally, again, and I will name some examples, a kind of a leadership based on populism, based on xenophobic fears in their own societies, based on conflicting argumentation, and this creates, of course, a problem. Recently, people started talking, and it came to Turkey a couple of weeks ago, post-truth society, something called post-truth society. And in Turkish medium, it has been discussed in the last couple of weeks. you lie outrageously, you lie continuously, and don't dwell on your lie, create another lie. So this has becoming a kind of a plan or kind of a model for the global politics in different countries. The latest example, of course, is Trump in the United States. And he's not the only example, of course. This is so global phenomena, it runs from Southeast Asia to United States. You know, it's everywhere, in Europe, in Middle East, in Russia, everywhere. We have repeatedly, same type of leadership is emerging, same type of politics is emerging, and I don't know where this is going to lead to us, because this also fits into the racism, xenophobia, hate speeches, and etc. So this is bound to create more conflicts around the globe, inside the countries, definitely. And also post-truth society, even the idea itself creates a kind of a loss of faith within the countries, at least part of the population, about their leaders, about their politics, the value of politics, value of democracy, etc. And this would create, of course, more internal conflicts and internal problems as well. The third issue, somehow maybe related to loss of faith, is a rise of extremism and global terrorism. This is not a new phenomenon. It's not recent. And rise of extremism is about now, or maybe I should say re-rise of extremism, because we saw different waves of extremism in the past. But the one that we are talking now is since Al-Qaeda, or even before Al-Qaeda, actually, maybe 15 years, some kind of a span here. It prompted with number of reasons, but you can put the beginning to 1979, when Iranian revolution took place against one superpower. I'm saying against in brackets, not directly against the United States, but many people, of course, because of the U.S. power in Iran, everything, you can consider it was a success against the U.S. dominant. And also, at the same year, the Afghanistan, this time a Sunni Islamic power, again winning against another superpower. So there were two superpowers of the world, and they lost in two different venues, and against Islamists, actually. One Sunni Islamist, the other one's Shia Islamists. That had a profound effect in political life globally. And that started in various forms emergence of extremism based on religion. But it jump on the other areas, the extremism not only related to religion, but also the other areas also affected from this on. And in the last 15 years, we have seen this problem quite fast. Terrorism has, I'm sure you are all familiar about the discussion, whether it has changed its style, it's completely different than what it was before, and etc. And it's true. The new terrorism, or some people like to call it global terrorism, is totally different than the ancient terrorism or what we had in 20th century. 21st century, this is about my column tomorrow. So, okay. The 21st century's terrorism, the one fundamental aspect of it is that it's transnational. It's really global. It's not only Al-Qaeda. It's not only because Al-Qaeda attacked the United States in 9/11. All other sorts of terrorist organizations now has become transnational. And most of the time they are acting out in areas and regions unrelated to their origin. And another, I'll give you a couple of figures, then I'll say something else. And the last year, 2015, there was 29,000 plus, about 30,000 deaths as a result of terrorist actions globally. 30,000 people died last year because of terrorist attacks. There were 12,000 separate individual terrorist attacks in 2015, 12,000. Can you imagine that, in a day, how many attacks can happen? Divide 12,000 by 365. So it's not an you can understand that this is not an isolated event in any country. It's global phenomenon. Everywhere there are terrorist attacks. Currently, there are 274 active, alive terrorist groups globally. So, every country has more than one, it seems. Or there are some others are more lucky; they have more, and others less. But 74% of all the deaths, this 30,000 deaths, are caused by 4 groups only. 4 international terrorist groups: ISIS, Boko Haram, Taliban, and Al Qaeda. So these are the most deadliest terror organizations of last year. And last year was actually a good year as far as terrorism is concerned, because the figures is down 10% down from 2014. So 2015 actually the security forces managed better than 2014. So this is the better situation actually. Another thing to notice about terrorism is that it's increasingly focusing as a kind of a triangle, an area of triangle made by North Africa, Middle East, and Sub-Sahara. Most of these organizations emerge from this region, and most of these attacks happening in this region. 9/11 was a huge attack, of course, in terms of number of people killed and affected, but since then, the number of terrorist attacks in Western countries, not only in the United States, but Western countries, are decreasing tremendously, and it's increasing in this triangle. So that's, I think, also important. The fourth is kind of related to this, but not as well. The changing character of war, I think, is important for today's security problems. Changing character of war. When we look at war and classical war studies, the definition of war is fight between two states, and they're between two armies of two states. And if you look at the figures, I can give you fascinating figures here. For example, there isn't one single day in the world since the end of the Second World War that we didn't have a fight. We didn't have a war globally. Since the end of the Second World War, 1945, every day there was and there has been a war going on somewhere in the world. So the war is something permanent here. We have not succeeded eradicating it. In the 20th century, we thought that we are so improved in humanity and thinking and everything and against the war. That's not the case. Secondly, but the character of war is changing, of course. The war between big powers are declining. The war where so many countries involved are declining, the number of the wars. But the other type of wars are increasing. The wars between small powers or smaller countries, the war between less number of countries, and more importantly, this is the new security environment, the war within the states. So since 1945, if you look at up until Second World War, the most of the wars and war-related deaths were the wars between states. Since the Second World War, now it's within states. And since the end of the 20th century, in the 21st century, almost all wars have some sort of internal civil war part of it. It's either civil war directly or a war induced by a civil war. So now new phase is the civil wars. And what's important for the civil wars, they are much more ferocious, violent, and dangerous than any war between states. Because people, humanity have been working on eradicating or trying to eradicate the war. There are so many rules and regulations that that actually goes around about the war between states. Try to limit it and, etc. But there is nothing such rules and regulations for civil wars. So civil wars are all out fighting and killing each other. And if you look at the pictures and the numbers and etc., the civil wars are, of course, much more deadly. If you compare the percentages of the population, civil wars are much more deadly than interstate wars, and barbaric, actually. In the state-to-state wars, you don't see people cutting the other side's heads, for example, or kind of throwing them into the bins and burning them, whatever. But we see this kind of things in civil wars between people who know each other previously, or friend with each other, or neighbors, etc. So this is something is increasing, a new security environment. The fifth is kind of a classical type of security problem, is the state challenges to existing or established international security system. Now, we have a security system, a global security system, which was created by, let's accept, by the leadership of the United States and West. And at the end of the Cold War, the West in general won the Cold War, so the system are styled even more so according to the US wishes and the Western wishes. Okay, but this is now, and this is not recent, of course. I mean, this system has been being established since the Congress of Vienna, so it's 200 years in the making. And the rules of this system is are being challenged now by other states. Now, whether we might like it, we might support it, or we would disagree with the idea, but this is happening. For example, an example is a very recent one, annexation of Crimea by Russia. Unilateral annexation of Crimea. It violates so many rules and regulations of 200 years of international relations and life. What this will create and how, whether it will become a security problem, I don't know. But it already, some signs are developing. There are so many, for example, over NATO airspace in Europe. There are so many near runs. 2014, I think the Russian airplanes violated the European airspace 4,000 times more than they did it in 2013. Right? I mean, it was already extensive in 2013, but in 2014 it was more, 4,000 more added. 2015, even more. Just to give you an example how extensive this is, just imagine a European map. What the Russians do, for example, they send an aircraft, the military aircraft, of course, fighter aircraft, through the North Sea, passing between France and UK, the channel, over the channel, and going through around Europe and violating Portuguese and Spanish airspace. And of course, fueling in the middle, mid-air fueling at the time. This is a big operation, and why do they do it? I mean, okay, you violate airspace of your neighbors, that happens between Greece and Turkey, for example, number of times. But it's there, you do it. But I mean, you pass through a continent, you pass through airspaces of 20 other countries, violating each of them, and then go to a poor, small Portugal, in the end of Europe, and you violate the Portugal airspace. Why? And this is of course a message. It's testing also at the same time. It's testing the strategic response time, whether the NATO is able to respond on time, where are the weaknesses, if there is a war, I can attack that. This is all tactical things. But it also shows a disregard, total disregard of the rules of engagement and rules of international relations and security. What this will mean, we'll see. Because this is related to another issue, which is what position because whether this will become a security problem for all of us, it will be related to my next issue, which is what position would the United States take to sustain international security system that it created in the first place? Now, we know what Obama did or didn't do, but he's leaving the next president of the United States a new sort of a challenging international security environment that the new president of the United States have to make so many fundamental decisions about this international security. It will affect us. Whether he would have a new reset moment with Russia, like Obama tried to do in the second, or whether he is going to be a more challenging and more hardliner against Russia, it will have tremendous influence and effect for us, all of us. If United States decides to make it a new Cold War with Russia, then it affects us, everybody, not only us, everybody. Or if they decide to, okay, this is the right of Russia to have more role and place in international security, that also would affect us. So this is my own feeling is that he's going to gravitate towards more interventionism in international relations, despite of all his rhetoric. Trump is against all this Well, I think within a year we will see a worse than Bush moment. Let's hope not, but that's my prediction. And finally, let's talk about the new. Dimitri put new security challenges. Actually, they are old new security challenges. We all know about them. The environment, challenges of environment, ecology, economic problems, refugees, etc., etc. The problem is not that they exist, and not that they are more important than yesterday. The real problem now is that they are not considered as problem anymore. There was a moment after the end of the Cold War, when I say moment, understand 10 years, that there was a discussion of new security problems and threats, and everybody were focusing on these issues. Global warming is important, and the rise of voters, and people were trying to do something about them. I'm saying trying to do. They didn't do much, but it was in the discussion. Now, with the current discussion in different countries, when you look at it, including the United States, Europe, and etc., these problems are relegated into the secondary place. These are not that important. Most probably Trump will going to go against the actions against the global warming. He might just start doing whatever he likes to do for the economy, etc. So this is also a problem, because these problems do exist. If we don't deal with them, they don't go away. They will become only bigger. And of course, the last thing that relates to this is refugees. The crisis of, and now it's becoming, it's not only, I'm not talking about refugees just because it's a problem between Turkey, Greece, involved Greece, Turkey, and Europe, etc. No, it is again becoming a global, continuous, permanent problem. Because we are facing with the Syrian refugee crisis now, we are thinking and talking about it, but apart from that, globally, the numbers of refugees are increasing, and the time that the refugees spending in the refugee, when the country that take refuge is getting longer and longer, and this means that the world is not able to provide them a security, a new future, and then they become more disillusioned, and we know what happens. Then they become a suicide bomber somewhere. We have seen this before in 1960s and 70s in Palestinian refugee camps. So are we going to, I think we are, not are we. We are already seeing some signs of it, but this is the new repetition of the same thing, but this time it's not Middle Eastern problem, it's becoming a global problem. So I'll stop here.
Well, thank you very much. A lot of food for thought in what you've said, and after we hear Kostas Ifandis, then we'll have a discussion. I was just thinking before I pass the floor to Kostas, how, you mentioned the climate change agreement, which Trump seems to suggest that he's going to revoke it. And here we were, this was December 2015, a year ago, in Paris, triumphant. I mean, even though the world did not look good in December 2015, there was this big, big ray of hope. I was just listening yesterday, the speech, I suggest you all listen to it, by the Colombian president at the Nobel, when he received his Nobel Award this weekend. Incredible. I mean, I was just thinking of one ray of hope last year. This was it. A 34-year-old conflict, armed conflict, put to an end. And the most comprehensive peace deal in the last 3 decades. I think there's been a study of all armed conflicts, and this is the most comprehensive peace deal, which was challenged because once it was reached, it was negated in a referendum, and they still found a way around it, and the deal is on. And albeit all of that, most of the challenges still persist. Anyway, that's food for thought. Professor Fandis, your turn, if you want to talk.
Okay, thank you very much. Mustafa Aydin has covered most of the ground, so let me start with a couple of remarks. First of all, what Mustafa Aydin has enumerated for us is actually what I would call that we've lost predictability in international politics. International politics, is interesting anyway, and it's a challenge to human intellects because it is foggy, and you can have different arguments, different interpretations, different explanations about what is going on. But nevertheless, there has been in our generations some sort of predictability. So we've lost the Cold War predictability. It was easy to analyze things, and now we are in a process of losing whatever benchmarks were there in terms of understanding what is going on. And it's always useful to think when we're talking about the new or the strategic environment and the global status or state of affairs, to think in 3 layers. Okay, the global, and where the big players, the big actors interact, the regional, where you have the middle level actors, and domestic, local levels, where you have new trends, new unpleasant trends unfolding, like populism or like exclusion instead of inclusion, atavism instead of cosmopolitanism, and so on and so forth. So, the global level, and what I'm trying to do now is to put in boxes what Mustafa Aydin has said. Sort of at a global level, United States, this is the basic, the most fundamental point of uncertainty, because so far we knew that the United States were behaving in a particular way. They were predictable. There was a crisis, they will do this or that, they will intervene if their interests were really at stake, or the stakes for regional and global stability were high. Now it's wait and see. Mustafa Aydin thinks that Donald Trump will, at the end of the day, turn into a very traditional interventionist, and I'm not ready to dispute that. Why people like Trump, when they realize the power they can yield, it's very hard to restrain themselves. So this is one. The other is the debate about China and the impact of a rising China, or of a slow slowing down China on the international bargain. And third is Russia with its more assertive, more aggressive, more strategic effort to return to areas that had been kicked out of since the 70s. And at the domestic level, I've already alluded to that with the rising of populism, and the rise of populism in societies and in political and in polities where you would less expect it to happen, like in Europe or in the United States. Conflicts, I had a few things to say about conflict, but Mustafa didn't said everything again. Let me just indicate that if there are good news, the good news that there will be no systemic war between the big actors, which is, never say never again, but nevertheless, the problem, which is a good thing that this problem exists, is that for those actors like China, Russia, United States, it is extremely hard to define what victory is in a war between them. Okay? Their destructive capability is so high. The technological advances applicable to warfare are unimaginable, that when you think about a war between the United States and China, what is victory? So maybe this is the only good news, I think, the fact that we haven't been able to define victory in such a systemic war that would keep us out of. It's something parallel to the mad doctrine of the Cold War. So what we're facing here is the trampling of the two basic pillars of international stability: legitimacy and power. There is no consensus on what legitimacy is in international politics and in international security, and there is no real consensus that we need a mechanism which can provide for a meaningful management of the balance of power. So an equilibrium. There is no consensus how we could go about both at global, regional, and domestic, local levels. So let me now give you what I think are the most important issues very briefly. And I will focus on Europe, on Russia, Eurasia, and on the Middle East and Eastern Med. What are the problems? What are the security or political challenges in Europe? First of all is Brexit. It's not just Britain, a traditional Eurosceptic, is out of the European Union, is that neither the Brits, neither the rest in Europe know what to make of it. And of course this has to do with the lack of leadership, because we don't have a vision, we don't have leadership, we don't have leaders that can talk about processes and trends. We don't have leaders that can discuss how Europe or the world would look like in 15 or 20 years. So what we are doing is trying to solve day-to-day problems, which is, yes, it is important, but it does nothing to mobilize resources for shaping, implementing strategies and affecting and shaping the world affairs as well. So Britain, Brexit poses enormous risks for both Britain and Europe. Second, European defense capabilities. we don't usually discuss these things because we have NATO, but with the increasing assertive, with an increasingly assertive Russia that had its way in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Syria, then European defense policies are more important than ever, and they are in flux. You know, there has not been a real effort to adapt to the threatening posture of Russia. And I'm not implying a need, an imperative for higher spending, because what we are missing in Europe is working together, complementing each other. So boosting our deterrent capabilities without spending more. So it's about cooperation. The third is terrorism in Europe, terrorism in traditional cosmopolitan emblematic urban centers like Paris, like Brussels, and elsewhere. And it's not just that terrorism hits the heart of European values, but it's that the responses are fragmented, unclear, and there is no real debate. That's the most frightening thing. And also let me finish my Europe list with Greece. First of all, the continuing uncertainty, Greece's inability to grow out of the crisis, and if that was just about Greeks, who cares? But it's the fact that that continuing decline, you know, fuels mistrust and animosity in Europe as well. Alexis Tsipras, you know, he claimed that he wanted to change Europe. Yes, he can change it for the worse, or he can contribute. And finally, Turkey. Turkey is at crossroads, not because there have been 24 terrorist attacks in the last 24 months, I think, something like that. I've seen most of them extremely bloody, but it is in a process of changing its polity, and not in a consensual way. Russia, I've already talked about Russia, but it's the fact that the relationship between Russia and the West has deteriorated to levels of antagonism not seen in decades, and that heightens the relevant risks. Ukraine remains an open wound. Actually, although we've stopped discussing about Ukraine, but Ukraine has become a protracted conflict, despite at least two ceasefire agreements. And, of course, that is boosting Vladimir Putin's approval rating to all-time highs in Russia, which means that Russian nationalism is at a record high. Opposition, whatever meaningful opposition, is marginalized, and a climate of intolerance is rapidly developing inside Russia. In Ukraine itself, domestic politics remain fractious as ever. One thing that is also adding to the uncertainty is the oil price fall, which has hit regional economies in Asia, in Eurasia, but also in Russia, and it has exposed structural weakness in seemingly stable regimes so far. And finally, Middle East and North Africa. You know, I'm not going to talk about Syria, I'm not going to talk about Iraq, I'm going to talk about Iran and the nuclear agreements, which we thought, or we've been thinking, that it will reshape the calculation, the posture and behavior of many actors in the region and outside in a much more positive way. We know now that the Iran nuclear agreement reshapes the calculation, the posture, and the behavior of actors like Saudi Arabia in a negative way. So we have Saudi Arabia and Iran as vacuum fillers now that the United States have been retreating from the region, antagonizing each other. And the problem is not the regional antagonism. The problem is that this antagonism is also very cultural, very religious, very sectarian. So Iran's likely conduct after the deal is a significant unknown. You know, we are not out of the woods in terms of regional escalation, but also detente is equally possible. We hope for the better, but there is nothing we can do to control the flow of events, because the big powers, they don't. United States, they did the opening. With the election of Trump, things are getting bad. So I will, and finally, Saudi Arabia, as I said, let me finish with that, is much more assertive under the new king, and it has taken on significant security and political risks with its intervention in Yemen. And at the same time, Egypt is nowhere to be seen as a stabilizing factor in Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, while Netanyahu's hegemony in Israel deems the limited prospect of Israeli-Palestinian progress, and it can aggravate relations between West and Israel. So this is what I had to say. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Dimitri.
Thank you. I mean, one of the interesting things about both speakers, I was just thinking that, first, if we take Professor Efendi's approach, he took a state approach, right? He looked at states, countries, state actors. And then if I think a little bit about the 7 points that Professor Aydin presented, again, what there seems to be, and this is what I've been writing also, is that there seems to be a return of the state. I mean, even your figures about, you know, terrorist attacks being down, or armed conflicts being down, there seems to be a return, or how, you know, what's been happening, you know, horrible things happening in Syria and Aleppo. It's state actors retaking right now the upper hand. So when you talk about the Boko Harams and the ISIS and the Talibans and the Al-Qaedas, we fear them, but they are more silent, or they are basically cornered, I would think. And I wonder what this means. But the return of the state, but what kind of state? In increasingly divided societies, where there's not necessarily, I mean, the word legitimacy was used by both of you, there seems to be no consensus at times about who runs, who controls, who leads these states. No consensus about policies the states would take. And this might also be a new phenomenon, which is a reaction to what is happening. So even when we talk about populism and nationalism, well, it is on the basis of the definition of a nation state as well within Europe, right? So where we feared in the past successive French elections not getting the National Front into the second round of the presidential election, now we have to add Austria to the list, maybe Hungary to the list, but it's still on a state basis, so what we're talking about Europe or elsewhere. So this is one of my takes from what I've heard. But the challenges are out there, right? The challenges are out there. And the picture is not is not necessarily a very pleasant one, because the successes in the international environment are few. The challenges are getting greater. And I think Professor Ifandis put it correctly when he was trying to explain what Professor Aydin presented. We lost the predictability of international politics, which means that scholars such as ourselves that spend our time trying to explain it through various theoretical models, and hence we're having a problem analyzing these things because they don't seem to fit into set patterns. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges. And you also said we're in the process of losing whatever benchmarks we had, right, in order to understand what's going on. So the floor is yours. Well, here we have questions already. Could we have the microphone, please? Yeah. Okay, we'll start over there, and then up on top, the gentleman, last gentleman. I'll take people who haven't spoken, and I'll get back to you. Please introduce yourselves and then ask your question.
I'm Ahmed Saadili, a PhD candidate in international relations here. First of all, I would like to say that Professor Mustafa, it was a very detailed analysis and impressive to say the least. I would like to connect some dots from your 7 points. You said lack of leadership across the globe and lack of trust, values, and rise in xenophobia and rise of extremism. I think the reason of the chaos that we find ourselves in international system today is that there is more lack of leadership in smaller or regional powers comparatively to the global ones. There haven't been any state to defy what you said, that there was this rise in xenophobia, not even on the cultural or societal or psychological fronts. We failed to defy those values or even confront them or rival or challenge them. So there's been a hegemony post the Cold War in the international system, and a young superpower that has witnessed too much power in its lap for its own liking is overstretching it. So do you think that this probable, I would say Syria is in some aspects beyond, a confrontation between Russia and America than we witnessed in the Cold War era? They would try to circumvent at instances in the Cold War, for instance, not to have their weapons or their labels. They would try to take care of those things during the Cold War era, but you don't see such precautions anymore now. So do you think this divergent discourse of China today and defiance, as you said, of the Russia of the, let's say, Portuguese airspace, or this flexing of muscle, is it going to create an order, or in the longer run, more stable world order?
I'm Kaan Özgüney from Sabancı University. I'm a MA student at Conflict Analysis and Resolution Program. I'm also a Future NATO Fellow at Atlantic Council. My question, actually my comment, is related to a follow-up with my friend's question over there. And also a comment on Professor Aydin's statements on that our security challenges are actually, the rules are being challenged by Russia. I agree. But it all began with the U.S. unilateral actions since Bush. The U.S. dropped its multilateralism. It enacted its unilateral actions again. And the rules, the engagements, the orders that U.S. created during the Cold War is no more. And thus, whole Europe and Europe within itself, everyone has divergent issues, divergent interests, and even in the NATO context, each country is trying to pursue their national interests. That, of course, every nation has to do it, but there is no more NATO leadership, and there is no more US leadership. And, for example, it was the French initiative that actually, which ended up as a NATO mission. and it was U.S. initiative which ended up as a NATO mission in Afghanistan. But there were no, for Afghanistan, no Russian support, if I remember correct. I may be wrong about that. Yeah. So with this context, this is actually the most challenging, not just Russia, but even the US itself is challenging the world order. And everyone has different divergent interests, and our publics, the liberal democracies, are also being challenged. As during your final statement, Professor Triantaphyllou, you said that the people are not supporting any wide range of policies that current mainstream governments are taking, and thus this leads to even more turmoil. So what can we do? Like, should, I don't know, how, if possible, our governing bodies, including NATO, have some sort of public diplomacy, create some sort of leadership for whole the Western Hemisphere publics to support such policies, if possible. Actually, I was going to ask that to Mr. Ildem, but he wasn't here, so.
Let me go there, and then we'll have a second round.
Thank you very much. My name is Margaret Ascudi, and I'm an LLM student at Leiden University in Public International Law. And I would like to ask Professor Aoudin, you referred to new terrorism as a challenge, a global challenge, and you underlined that is a global phenomenon. However, we know that there is not a specific definition of terrorism, like from the UN, but there are several definitions of terrorism from regional international organizations. So I would like to ask you, like, from a legal perspective, do you believe that the lack of definition delimits our effort to fight terrorism? And from a political perspective, should the UN and especially the ILC committee, should try and should proceed to quantify and define the term of terrorism? Thank you.
Nobody asks Costas questions, just
well, he's an old grey man, so people don't want to warn. Starting, I mean, when you said the return of state, of course, I think the moment is 2008, when we had the meltdown, the global financial crisis, 2007 and 8, then people suddenly realized that the end of state was not such a good thing. And this was kind of end of neoliberal liberalism in economy, and the start of more interventionism and state organization of economy, and that also lead to more state in international relations too. I think that's the moment, end of the Cold War to 2008, where we were discussing the end of nation state or state or less state and etc. But now it's the meltdown created return of state, and the state is different. I think. I mean, you are right. I don't know what kind of a state has returned yet. It's not a neoliberal state anymore. It's not a really realist state either, but something is emerging, and with less legitimacy, less loyalty from its citizens. Maybe it's, let's name it post-state state, so let's leave it there. I don't know what its definitions yet. I'm not a political scientist and haven't thought about that much. Okay, coming to the other. This lack of leadership and inability to define values and that people could follow and etc. Whether this could create more stable or less stable world, a new system, again, I don't know. I mean, most of the questions, my response would be, I don't know. Because the questions are more speculative, and it depends on the perspective you are looking. But something I know from history, that if you look at international system, it goes like this. I mean, there are times that it's tightly regulated, hegemonic type of system. Then there are other times it's less regulated, there are less hegemony, less rules, and more fighting and disputes, and etc. So I like to hope that this is a phase also, and it will be leading something more peaceful. But nobody can really predict how long this phase will take. It eventually will lead to some sort of a world system. We don't know now what it is. Certainly we are not having two-block system. Certainly we don't have unilateral, unipolar system. And it's not multipolar system as some people were arguing. It's not yet. It shows elements, but it's not. And if you look at the telltale signs, this world system of today, to become multipolar system, it will take like 50 plus years. If we are heading to that direction. But otherwise, I'm not sure which kind of a system we are directing, but it's still being made up. That's a part of the difficulty that we are all having to analyze because we don't know what is the system yet. Rules are, of course, my point was actually state challenges to the established international system, and I then went into the easy way of using Russia as an example. But what you say is, of course, correct. Just look at the debate on responsibility to protect. That was a Western invention, American and European invention, and it was, especially the Russians, perceived it another way of kind of imperialism or, prolonging the Western leadership, and eventually they killed it. Number of examples: Kosovo, final coffin was Libya, of course, and nobody talked about responsibility to protect when Syria came along, for example. But you are right; it was challenged by the U.S. and the West in general first, but now it's challenged from everywhere. And my point is this one. Yes, without not having a specific specific definition of terrorism that everybody agrees would and is definitely limits how to fight about it. Sure, but I'm not sure whether it would do any good if we start a new discussion within UN or any other body. I mean, the discussion has been going on for years and years, and this is where we are. And where we are is not that bad, actually. We all know what the terrorism is. When we face it, we know it. The dispute comes out of the conflicting national interest, and they will be there forever. So whether you have a definition, a legal, sort of a document that many countries sign or not, it doesn't make any difference. We know what the definition of war is, but there is still wars. So it doesn't add on. It will help, but otherwise, if we want to fight with terrorism, current legal system is enough. But we choose not to because of national interest, conflicting national interests.
You want to add something to these questions? No? Okay. Let's move to this side.
Thank you. Actually, I have a question for both professors. You both mentioned...
Your name is?
Dr. Nikos Lambas. You both mentioned, Professor Aydin mentioned that we have 30,000 dead last year from terrorism. By any standards, that means war. By any standards. So, based on Professor Triantapyllou's comment about the return of the state, maybe the solution lies in the return of the great power state and not simply the state. Are we perhaps experiencing the results of the United States security umbrella, the post-Cold War security umbrella, that somehow states forgot how to fight and forgot to wage war? I mean, I'm not implying that war is the answer, But when you are dealing with so many casualties, when you are dealing with so many terrorist incidents, when you are dealing with a transnational issue, a planetary issue, maybe the first planetary issue apart from the environment, then maybe it is worth considering the possibility of, I don't know, a full-scale frontal attack. Sorry, but that's my view.
The gentleman behind you.
Thank you again. Yannis Marchaltas, PhD candidate, Pondia University. One question for Professor Aydin. Again, Global Leadership Gap you mentioned, and there were a couple of questions, but the way I understand, you don't consider global leaders, neither Barack Obama nor Vladimir Putin. I would like a comment on both of them, if possible, on why you don't consider them global leaders. And thank you. And for Professor Ifadis, you talked about Saudi Arabia and Iran relationship, but a few professors, a few scholars globally actually, consider that the deterioration of United States-Saudi traditional alliance is one of the emerging challenges of our times. And during the election period in the United States, Hillary Clinton tried to deteriorate, let's say, this relationship by accusing Saudis for terrorist attacks in the United States and other reasons. Hillary Clinton, of course, is not the president today, but do you think that there is a trend, there are problems in the Saudi-United States relationships that cannot be overcome, and now we're passing the new era of United States intervention in the Middle East?
Okay, let's take two more here. Three, okay. Oh, yeah.
I have to end for
Yeah, okay. Let's start here first.
Thank you. My name is Amal Ushnan. I'm a PhD candidate in the International Relations Department. My question is for Dr. Mustafa Aydin. How do you explain the relation between terrorism and foreign military intervention? Especially that if we observe, we will find that the extremist group emerged after the military interventions, especially Taliban in Afghanistan, or Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or ISIS in Libya. Thank you.
Okay. No, yeah, there.
Thank.
No, you're next. You're fine.
It's okay. My name is Maria Kulpa. I am a student in Mediterranean Studies at the University of Peloponnese. Thank you, professors, all three. But I want to address Mr. Mustafa Aydin about the changing character of wars and how nowadays wars are more internal or within the states. But I think that we are neglecting the external supporters, and how the majority of the civil wars I can think of are in reality proxy wars, or they have external supporters. So maybe the war is not changing that much.
Okay, and last question.
Çağrı Çevik, I'm a PhD student here at Kadir Has. My question is, I guess, for the whole panel. There are two pieces of news on BBC and New York Times today. One of them is a ceasefire has been struck in Aleppo so that the rebels can leave the city for good and the regime forces will move in. And the second piece of the news was U.S. actually stopped arms shipment to Saudi Arabia because of indiscriminate killing in Yemen. So these two news, I think, point to a fact that sort of the balance shift or the preference of the West is shifting from Sunni to Shia. What's your comment on it, I would say?
Okay. Just a quick follow-up, very quick. Yeah.
The ceasefire was failed.
Take the microphone, but quickly.
And then the ceasefire that the PhD candidate,
Chari, his name is Chari.
mentioned actually failed today as well, allegedly due to Iranian militias attacking.
No,
It doesn't
no,
matter. It's
doesn't, of
only
course it
a
doesn't.
small piece of territory.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, let's go back to the speakers. You want to start, Kostas?
I'll be very brief, and I'll be brief because I cannot start talking about terrorism. Now, what is the novel element of our generation's terrorism? Okay, it's mass. It takes very much. It exploits the states and international advantages that are there in terms of networking, in terms of knowledge, in terms of communication. We know all this, and it's suicidal. What is the problem with all this? The fact that you've got people that are ready to die, no matter what, means that you don't have an effective deterrent against it. How can you deter someone who has already decided to assume the highest cost? No, so you cannot, there is no effective deterrent in the traditional sense of the word. That gap, you know, that problem means that the response is the increase in what we call national security apparatus in several Western, especially, and not only Western, all over the globe, which means that then you have a problem with democracy. How do you combine the rise of a new national security state, much more effective in monitoring, in following people with democratic values? Terrorism has been with us for centuries. It will continue to be with us, and but as I said, there is no easy way to deal with it. If had it been an easy way, they would have found it. There are people much smarter than we are in this panel, so it's not strange that we don't have the answers. I think that's what I had to say. The other thing is about the state issue. This is excellent. We can discuss this. And I agree with Mustafa Aydin that we don't know what kind of polities we are going to have in a few years' time, or in a few decades, or in a century. But one thing is certain, that everybody is using the basic fundamental prerogatives of Westphalia. Okay? So security, armed forces, sovereignty, even targeting enemies. So I don't know how far we are from the ancient regime of Westphalia. At least, everybody loves it, and especially the newly emerging states. Newly, I mean, after the Second World War, they love it, and they are not ready to relinquish the advantages of Westphalia.
Starting something Kostas said and linking, let's wage all-out war against terrorists, but who are they? Where are we going to attack, and how? That's the problem. Terrorists are, except ISIS, of course, they are not state. So you cannot bomb certain places. You cannot achieve bombing certain places to stop terrorism. And Kostas, as Kostas mentioned, indicated, that if you are fighting with somebody who's willing to die, then the war is not a solution. Because let's not forget, the aim of the war is to win the war with as less as possible cost to yourself, not an annihilation of both sides. If the other side is seeking annihilation, because it is going to go in a nicer place after that, then you lost just without starting.
The only option you have is to die, to wipe everybody out. You know?
That's something else. State versus great power state, more stable, I don't know. I mean, this is something that we lived through. We thought the Cold War was stable, of course, and an empire would be even more, global empire might be more stable like the Roman Empire, but still, Leviathan. But still, then we will start talking about the problems within that empire. I'm not sure that's the solution. The one problem is, I was thinking, our generation, and all of you, I would say, we have grew up in a world which was progressively moving towards more and more liberal type of state. Now we are kind of end of that liberal state, and something else is emerging and we don't know yet. And that makes us uncomfortable. From this perspective, when you look at what is emerging, is something is very horrible. Security state, what cost us the Stalin type of thing. Yeah, everybody likes that now. It's happening everywhere, and it terrifies us. We didn't see the other version. Maybe it's not that bad. I don't know. I never lived in that kind of a state. But something is emerging, and it's not certain yet. I'll leave the global leadership to the others are just connected to this. Sure, there is a correlation and connection between terrorism and foreign military intervention. Foreign military intervention sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes create more terrorists, but sometimes it solves the problem. But let's not forget, it's not always the foreign military intervention that creates terrorism. It has something to do with it, that's for sure, but if we didn't have it, we would have the terrorism. When it started in ancient times, the zealots, as the original terrorists and fighters, there was no state intervention. So there could be other reasons, but in recent years, that certainly this is one of the effects and inputs for increase of terrorism. Changing character of wars, definitely it's changing. Whether there is an external wars, external supporters, whether the proxy wars is increasing, it doesn't matter. It's still different than what we had during the Second World War, or the First World War, or Vietnam War. It's different. Something has changed, and it's more and more focusing inside the states, even if they have external connections. In the past, of course, that's also changing. The characteristics of civil wars is also changing. In the past, more typical civil wars was started in a country and it spilled over. Now the external influence is becoming more important for the emergence of civil wars, but that's also changing within itself. Looking just on the two news and making a huge conclusion from that, preference of the West has changed from it's jumping, I don't know what, it's too much. It might have changed, I don't know, but these are not only doesn't immediately indicate to that. So finally, Putin and Obama. Obama for me is like a cuddly bear, nice, steady. He's so nice, and he got Nobel Peace Prize without doing anything, right? Did he have any vision for the global world, how it should be governed? He doesn't have to, of course, that's for sure. Nobody has to. But, for me, somebody as a leader that I should think he should have some vision for somebody. He doesn't have a vision. He's criticized within his own country that he doesn't have a vision for the United States either. I'm sounding like a Republican now, but But yeah, I mean, but he's somebody is very nice to listen to. But when you come to the substance, it's all air there, you know. It's very nice and it's psychologically very good, but that's it. He doesn't tackle the very difficult problems, global problems I'm talking. Within his country he did some. Putin is of course an autocrat. I mean, a type of a leadership, that's for sure, but when you look at international perspective, international relations perspective, his vision is to create a kind of a state which puts Russian national interest in front and everybody is the secondary place. So that's not a vision for the global. Nobody could follow that. Some countries do in Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other SCO, etc., but they have to. Nobody follows it willingly. I haven't seen. I was in Armenia last week, and you know, I know how people feel about the Russian leadership there. So for me, it's not a leadership. It's different type of leadership for sure. But what I'm looking is kind of a inspiring, more liberal, democratic type of a leadership and visionary. That's lacking.
Yeah, I think Kostas wants to make an intervention. But regarding Putin, I think also thinking about your previous question about Russia. I mean, one of the things when we assess Russia is domestic determinants of Russia's behavior, right? And part of it has to do with his legitimacy at home, right? He had legitimacy as long as things were going well, as long as Russia was a player in the global energy markets because of high energy prices. And the same Putin in 2008 started changing, had a war with Georgia, with the results for Georgia, and the same Putin has gone on with the annexation of Crimea, where, by the way, none of the post-Soviet states have ever supported it, none. Even his partners within the Eurasian Economic Union have not supported it. It's Nauru and a couple of other Pacific islands. So it also has to do with his regime survival and legitimacy, which we have not really talked, because we really basically talked here about one level of analysis, right? And I think in Russia, if one follows it closely, a lot of it has to do with what's happening domestically. Now, Kostas Ifandis disagrees, and very quickly regarding Obama. So please.
I disagree. I think he had a vision about the United States' position and role in the world, and he did a lot. He did a lot about it. Okay, he legitimized the American position in the world again, which was a great thing after the Bush era. He negotiated with the Iranians, whether we like it or not, it doesn't matter. Okay, I'm not talking about domestic issues now. He managed to sort of pull out most of American troops from he challenged for the first time Israel. Okay, so and he brought back in the notion of multilateralism. Okay, he sponsored G20. He tried to address, succeeded in everything? Of course not. But I think he had a vision. He had a vision about Americans' role and position in the world. Whether we like it or not, I would have liked the United States, of course, to be much more interventionist in Syria earlier, but it's American troops that are going there, not Greek or others.
Okay. Well, let's thank our two speakers for their presentation and taking your questions. And thank you for coming to this. Those that are not part of the program are free, and those that are part of the program, we will be going upstairs to another room to have our first session, that's peer-to-peer workshops.